Hey, it's Nigel, and welcome back to Crew of Japan, a weekly podcast where we take you on audio journeys through Japanese culture. Okay, and welcome back to this week's episode. Today we are going to actually focus on the life of Lafcadio Hearn. In a previous episode, we actually talked about Hearn in a little detail about the Lafcadio Hearn Museum and his residence, which you can still visit today. But in today's episode, we actually want to focus more on Lafcadio Hearn's life and the legacy that he has left. And in doing that, we actually have help from one of our Japan Society members, which is also a perk of being in the Japan Society. You have the opportunity to actually come on and co-host an episode with us. So if you're interested, really consider joining the Japan Society. We'd love to have our members help and be a part of this podcast. So today, we actually have a very special member, Matt Smith, who is a member of the Japan Society and an expert on Lafcadio Hearn's life and legacy. So welcome to the podcast, Matt.
Hi, Nigel. Thanks for having me on.
So you actually teach in New Orleans, right?
I do. I'm a professor of English at Tulane. I teach a number of writing classes, some rhetoric seminars, but I also do a great deal of research on 19th century American literature, particularly the literature of South Louisiana and New Orleans. And so along the way there, you can't do that without hitting Lafcadio Hearn over and over again.
Yeah, it's really interesting. So was Lafcadio Hearn a big influence for you in deciding to teach English?
You know, it's interesting. My first exposure to Hearn was when I was in high school. I worked as a tour guide at a plantation museum in New Iberia, which is my hometown. And so, of course, in the gift shop, they have all kinds of Louisiana books, the same as any kind of tourist gift shop at a historical site. And a number of Lafcadio's pieces were there, or books that had excerpts from Hearn's work. And when I was younger, when I was in high school, maybe 16, 17, working that job, I remember flipping through them and initially being, very much in like the typical high schooler know-it-all mode, very dismissive. I thought, well, this is just this kind of Moonlight and Magnolia stuff. And there's not much here beyond the typical like romanticization of New Orleans, of the South. And it wasn't until I sort of revisited his work later when I was in grad school doing more serious work on 19th century literature that I realized that he was doing something far more complicated than, just romance for the sake of romance, or, the exotic for the sake of the exotic, that he actually had a far more sensitive worldview and a far more complex mind than just, the standard idealization of New Orleans.
Wow, it's really interesting. So at that time, did you even know about his writings on Japan when you were in high school and seeing those books?
I did. I think at that point, I knew of his Japanese work only as a kind of like blip on his biography. And it wasn't until later that I realized, like, well, wait, that's his kind of it's the majority of his corpus. That's like, by the time he gets there, it's where he spends most of his life. It's where he does most of his writing. And in many ways, for a very kind of intellectually restless man and an intellectually restless thinker, it really is in Japan where you see him sort of, I don't know, this may sound very kind of cliche or hokey, but where he does, I think, find his space intellectually, culturally, personally, emotionally, where he finds his family, like where he builds a functioning family for the first time in his life after a number of, to be sort of, to put it mildly, complicated family situations throughout his entire life, that when he gets to Japan, he finally finds a kind of stability that I think you can see him seeking throughout his biography.
Yeah, wow, that's so well put. So let's go ahead and dive into the roadmap of Lafcadio Hearn's life. If I'm not mistaken, he was born in Greece, actually, which is it's very hard to, imagine you have a writer who's left such a legacy on New Orleans and Japan and, obviously two different places, the United States and America, but he's from neither. It's quite interesting. How did he go from getting from Greece to New Orleans and then to Japan?
Well, so he's born in Greece, the son of Charles Hearn, a sort of British officer stationed there, and Rosa Casamati. Um, their their relationship, his parents' relationship, was quite turbulent. Eventually, Rosa brings Lafcadio, or Patrick Hearn, to to the family in Ireland, her husband's family, who are not pleased at all that this sort of this foreigner, this woman who is illiterate, has brought this child into their world. Um, Rosa eventually leaves Lafcadio there, goes back to Greece. Luckily, Lafcadio ends up in the care of Sarah Bernane, one of the family members, and she sends him to school in France. It's there that he has the sort of infamous accident that injures one of his eyes, that for the rest of his life would be sort of bulged out in a sort of grotesque way. This sort of speaks to his personality. He was such a self-conscious man, and so self-conscious about that eye, that if you look at photographs of him, you'll see that he is almost always turned in profile so that his good eye is showing and not the one that was bulged outward. People told some of his doctors told him like get glasses, and he was so scared of wearing glasses because he thought like if he strained that other eye, the remaining good eye, too much, he might lose his sight in that. And as you can imagine, for someone so connected to the written word, the loss of sight, would have been devastating for him. But anyway, so his time in Ireland, is cut short when the family, that's his father's side of the family up in Ireland, finally just kind of pushes him out and says, you know what, go to America, go, like, we got some distant contacts, some distant relatives there, go stay with them. Here's $5. Good luck. Well, he gets to America, no one's there. Like the contacts that he's supposed to meet there, they're like baffled. They don't know what to do with him. He ends up in Cincinnati, works there as a newspaper reporter for a while. Publishes some really cool stuff. The Cincinnati pieces, I would highly recommend going dig into, particularly his long form journalistic pieces where he he goes with this person who climbs church steeples, like to repair stuff or to do sort of architectural work, and the guy who works in the church steeples like straps Lafcadio to him and climbs the steeple with Lafcadio, like very kind of panicky, just strapped to his body while they climb over the city. There's another one where he goes to a slaughterhouse and like drinks an entire like pint glass of cow's blood because the people at the slaughterhouse are like, no, it's good for you. So you can see the strangeness of his writing emerging early on in Cincinnati. Like the things he was drawn to, the unusual, the grotesque, the odd, are there even that early on.
That's amazing. I just want to ask a quick question. How much of the Cincinnati work has survived to today?
Oh, a substantial amount. Even if you go up to the libraries in Cincinnati, they have a ton of his papers up there. And one good place if you're looking for, you're just a general reader looking for good excerpts, if you don't want to have to go dig through newspaper archives or anything like that. The author Jonathan Cott has a book called Wandering Ghost, The Odyssey of Lafcadio Hearn, which is a great sort of general purpose biography of Hearn. And one of the things I love about it so much is that Jonathan Cott, the biographer, lets Hearn speak so much in the biography. It's the biography will sometimes stop, and you'll get pages and pages of just excerpts from Hearn's stuff. And some of the great sort of highlights of the Cincinnati pieces are there in Jonathan Cott's biography, including both the steeple climber excerpt and the slaughterhouse excerpt. But yeah, I mean, while he was in Cincinnati, Hearn also met and married Alethea Foley, or Maddie Foley, as she's sometimes referred to. Their relationship was another sort of complex relationship in Hearn's life. He was a white man, she was a black woman. Their marriage was technically illegal under sort of the state law at the time. And Hearn, was a somewhat difficult man to get along with, at least during the American sort of part of his life. He and Maddie fought, sometimes violently. And of course, his relationship with her was endangering his reputation within the journalistic world of the town, and eventually he was forced out of his job, very much due to his marriage to her. Now, eventually he leaves Cincinnati and Maddie and comes down to New Orleans, and tries to begin a new life here. And it's here that he becomes, along with figures like George Washington Cable and Grace King, and Alice Dunbar Nelson, he becomes one of the figures who sort of invents the idea of exotic New Orleans as we know it now. He writes for a number of newspapers here, still doing sort of ghost stories and sketches about voodoo, and and here running into the same problems in New Orleans with interpersonal relationships that had dogged him throughout his life. He had many allies here in New Orleans and many people who identified his talent and wanted to foster it, but he was an incredibly sensitive man. And a pattern that he would fall into over and over again would be imagining that a friend had slighted him or like taking offense at some very minor slight, and then removing himself and becoming very cold and very distant to that person. And meanwhile, the person doesn't even know that they've upset Hearn. Like, well, where's Lafcadio? We haven't seen him in a while. And it's that Hearn was just such a sensitive person that he would sometimes self-sabotage his professional and personal relationships in those ways. Eventually, he leaves New Orleans. He would over and over again get frustrated with places that he saw had a lot of romance and strangeness and exotic romantic elements to them. And he would get frustrated when he'd see commercialism and the modern world sneaking in around the edges. And then he would write in his letters like, "Oh, well, I have to leave here. It's all New Orleans is becoming too, Americanized and too homogenized, and I have to get out and go somewhere else." So he goes to the Caribbean for a bit. He lives in Martinique for 2 years. And then eventually from there, he gets sent on assignment to Japan, to write some pieces for the American magazines about sort of just his experiences there. And that's where he stays. He finally, in Japan, after bouncing, all over the world, this very restless man, this very sensitive man, this very haunted man in many ways, suddenly finds a world and a culture that he himself is also fascinated by, but that opens up a place for him, that he marries into a Japanese family, the Koizumi family. He marries Koizumi Setsu. They have children together. He takes the family name. He becomes Koizumi Yakumo, and begins writing these incredibly loving, tender, sometimes strange and eccentric pieces about his sort of adopted nation. He teaches there. He ends up getting a job in Tokyo. Setsu, his wife, was delighted to move to Tokyo. And Hearn was more like, no, I want to stay in the rural parts of Japan. Like if I can stay in Matsue, right? I don't, because again, you see his anxiety about the city and about the modern world. But he's like, no, Tokyo. I don't want to go to the city. I don't want to like be around these elements of westernization creeping into this country. I want to stay in these rural spaces, these spaces in touch with traditional culture. So that may have been, I think I'd promised a 5-minute journey from Greece to Japan, and I think I've gone far over 5 minutes, but there's the sort of arc of his life and his sort of experiences.
That's amazing. Absolutely amazing. And I think packaged beautifully as well. So thank you. Thank you for that. So there's a few points I want to like actually go back and touch on. So since this podcast, we record this podcast out of, New Orleans. The two areas we really want to focus on in this episode is his time in New Orleans and his time in Japan. So to go back to his time in New Orleans first, he's often regarded, at least I've seen, as one of the key figures in creating the New Orleans mythos. Is that true?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, certainly before the Civil War, New Orleans had a kind of glamour and aura about it, as an exotic city within the United States, because of Spanish influences, French influences, African influences. The city was seen well before Hearn as something exotic and unusual within the American kind of framework. So it's not like Hearn, invented this out of thin air. The city did have a reputation for the exotic, but Hearn comes, into the city at a time when national like magazine culture and national newspaper culture is exploding. Like the level of access to print culture that the average citizen across the country, including all the way up north, had, was expanding greatly. And that these magazines, especially like things like Harper's, Scribner's, they love travel writing. It was a way to provide, let's say the average family in Boston with some experience of like, what it was like in other parts of the country. Two reasons for this. One of them being you have the railroad industry developing quite a bit after the Civil War. If you can pitch people on how cool other parts of the country are, how cool these other parts of the country are, you can get them to buy the train ticket and travel there, and you have the kind of beginnings of a modern tourism industry. So there's that element that like when Lafcadio is writing these pieces about New Orleans and they're getting published all over the place in magazines up north and newspapers up north, it's a way of, not to be too crass about it, but selling New Orleans to a national public as a place to come visit. So it's one element. The other element is that you have to realize we're in the 1870s. We're immediately after the Civil War. And I think in some ways the nation is trying to imagine how it can be one place with all kinds of disparate cultures and races and linguistic groups. How can we cohere as a republic with all these differences? And in some ways, the travel writing and the magazine culture was a way of like the nation working out those kinds of questions and imagining its diversity and unity at the same time. And so Hearn played a crucial role in that.
Yeah, and on that last point, that's something that I've often seen attributed to Hearn was he was rather unique in his approach to journalism. He was very willing and one of the few journalists that actually went out into Black communities, both in Cincinnati, but also in New Orleans, and really actually went out and connected and wrote about the experience of Black people in America at that time. And so you see that, from my understanding, in his New Orleans writing, and that becomes something that stuck and lasted the test of time. His writings about the experience of people in that time.
Yeah, in some ways, he was a journalist. He was a folklorist, in other ways, collecting sort of snatches of like Black Creole song in New Orleans, and yes, in some ways, he had a great sensitivity to the kind of marginalized figures of whatever community he was in, whether it be Cincinnati, New Orleans, the Caribbean, Japan, because I think in many ways he felt himself, even as a white man, sort of marginalized, sort of rootless, not quite knowing where he belonged or where he fit in. And he is writing at a time when a lot of approaches, of white authors writing about non-white communities, would partake in stereotypes, even if it was sort of positive elements of those communities, they would be like exaggerated in these very romanticized, versions of the Black community, or let's say, if we even go further into his time in Japan, so much of the writing in the late 19th century from non-Japanese people, from Europeans and from Americans, is treated as this kind of mysterious East, the kind of exotic Orient, and kind of flattening out the complexity of the space by treating it like a fairy tale. And while I think that there are elements in Hearn's writing that certainly slip into that, I think on the whole, he demonstrates a kind of sensitivity to nuance and to the complexity of like individual persons as well. And I think that's why he's still valuable. I think that's why we still read him in a way that so many other travel writers or folklorists of that period, have dropped off out of, the standard canon.
Yeah, absolutely. I think even if some of his writings, like you said, they have that element, they slip into that element sometimes. I think his work definitely still provides a lot of historical context and historical value to those time periods, either New Orleans, Cincinnati, or Japan, or the Caribbean. And I think it's really interesting because you look at his time in New Orleans, he actually wrote a cookbook.
Yes, La Cuisine Creole.
This cookbook was a compilation of Creole recipes, right? In Black and Creole recipes in New Orleans at the time, from the top chefs and even just local, home kitchens. I mean, to be able to get that access,
Mm-hmm.
he had to have at some level really connected with the people
Mm-hmm.
in those communities to get it. So it's amazing, and that cookbook you can still find today. It's still useful, and people are still making recipes from that cookbook, as we will actually see later in this episode. And there were some other. Are you familiar with any of his other? I'm sure you are, but what are some of his other writings from New Orleans?
Yeah, no, I mean, one of my favorites is his novella Chita, A Memory of Last Island, which depicts a kind of fictionalized version of a real hurricane, the Last Island hurricane of 1856 that hit this resort in the Gulf of Mexico, um, killed many people. Many people survived too, but Hearn's novel about that hurricane and a lost child and mixed up identity, um, and mixed up languages too, it is, I think, one of the highlights for me of his New Orleans work.
Okay, and you said it's fictional, but it's based on a real hurricane.
It's based on a real hurricane. August of 1856, there was a hurricane that hit Last Island. Um, Last Island doesn't, like Ile Dernière, like they don't really exist anymore as full islands. At the time, there was a huge resort, built up, and it was a popular summer vacation spot in the 1850s. Um, Now, because of erosion, I think maybe there's a few little strips of land out there that on the map are marked as Ile Dernière. But Hearn was always. I mean, I don't know if he was intentionally, you know, seeking out stories about that space because of an awareness of like coastal erosion or something like that. But it is in one way you can connect it to Hearn's sense for disappearing spaces and disappearing traditions. That when he's doing his work in New Orleans and in Japan, he has so much anxiety. And this was a common anxiety at the end of the 19th century, that with a rise in industrialization, with the rise in globalization, there were these kind of microcultures within the world that were getting bulldozed, and that were getting lost. And I think Hearn saw it as part of his job, to collect whatever he could of these stories, of these recipes, of these traditions, of these songs.
That's incredible, to be so plugged into the world and the changes that are going on around you, especially at a time pre-internet, to really be tuned into all the change and aware that's just really incredible. It's something you have to admire, for that time period. So Hearn decides one day to leave New Orleans. Was it a random decision one day, or was it I believe you said he went on an assignment to the Caribbean,
To Martinique.
to Martinique. Okay, so how did Hearn get from New Orleans to Martinique and then ultimately Japan?
I believe it was he gets to Japan in part because I may be misquoting the magazine. I'm almost certain it's Harper's. His sort of contact at Harper's Magazine asks him, "Look, you want to go to Japan and do a story for us there? Like, with the we're several decades after Matthew Perry's sort of expedition to Japan, but." Much as the national reading public in America was fascinated by these cultural enclaves in the United States, interested in New Orleans, interested in the Wild West, interested in the reaches of the forest of northern Maine. They were also interested in the cultures of other spaces that, because of globalized trade, you were getting more access to, and so there was a hunger for that among the American reading public. And Hearn, who's worked for these magazines for years and has submitted stuff for them, seems like the obvious choice. And so Hearn eagerly takes up the job, goes to Japan, and is struck by a world that he sees as deeply imbued with romance, with mysteriousness, with the kind of artistic delicacy. And you can read about that in his book, Glimpses of Unfamiliar Japan. The first sort of part of that book is called My First Day in the Orient, which describes his arrival and his first encounter with the space. And I think you can see, if you contrast his writing in that piece, My First Day in the Orient, with some of his later stuff, how his view of Japan nuanced over time. In My First Day in the Orient, you get a number of references to, like, oh, it's like being in a fairy tale and everything is very elvish, and you have these sort of fluttering, banners with different sort of pictographs on them, and it's like walking into, like, a fantasy world. And so we see him there definitely partaking in a kind of exoticization, romanticization of the space. But later, decades later, by the time he's writing his book, Japan, An Attempt at Interpretation, let me see if I can even read this out. I have it pulled up here because I want to read out a passage from it just so you can get a sense of the contrast. The first chapter of Japan, An Attempt at Interpretation, is called Difficulties. 1,000 books have been written about Japan, but among these, setting aside artistic publications and works of a purely special character, the really precious volumes we found to number scarcely a score. The fact is due to the immense difficulty of perceiving and comprehending what underlies the surface of Japanese life. No work fully interpreting that life, no work picturing Japan within and without, historically and socially, psychologically and ethically, can be written for at least another 50 years. So vast and intricate the subject that the united labor of a generation of scholars could not exhaust it, and so difficult that the number of scholars willing to devote their time to it must always be small. And you can hear, it's maybe a 20-year gap.
That's amazing.
It's him recognizing after, decades or so of living there, that he's not come upon a fairyland or some sort of mystical fantasy world. He's come upon just a rich culture, and a culture that he can't necessarily put into a neat and tidy box. He goes on to say later in Japan, An Attempt at Interpretation, that, one will finally begin to, a non-Japanese person will finally begin to understand Japan when they recognize that they will never understand Japan fully. And that kind of that's humility, amazing. The humility before the culture of the other, like, is something deeply important to his later works about Japan.
Yeah, absolutely is embodied in that. The humility is absolutely embodied in that quote, for sure. And, my understanding was that he actually converted to Buddhism while he was in Japan. And I feel that might also be influencing that view and that perspective, on life. And of course, we look at his work, it's still valuable, today, but it's amazing because I wonder if he saw it as, I've contributed to this point, all of this work, but I still don't understand it. I still have not reached it. And even though I've written about Japan now for years, I am not the authority on Japan.
And the title of the piece, that it's called Japan, An Attempt at Interpretation. It's not Japan, An Interpretation. Right. And even interpretation is a pretty soft word, but right. Even buffers it more. It's an interpretation. It is my attempt at an interpretation of Japan.
Right. And then, like you said, the very first chapter called Difficulties. Yes. Yeah, that's incredible. So to help guide us through Lafcadio Hearn's journey in Japan, Matt, Doug, and I actually sat down with two special guests for an interview.
I'm Bon Koizumi, the great-grandson of Lafcadio Hearn. Thank you very much for inviting us to the Clue of Japan podcast. It's very honor and happy for us. I have never seen my great-grandfather, but I had a good memory of my grandfather, Kazuo, who was the first son of Lafcadio Hearn. I was born and grew up in Tokyo, but more than 30 years ago, I moved to Matsue, where it is located in Western Japan, and Lafcadio Hearn lived and loved. I was fascinated with atmosphere of Matsue, including vapor-toned scenery, traditional culture, folklore, and good people. Now, I'm a director of Lafcadio Hearn Memorial Museum and Professor Emeritus of University of Shimane Junior College.
Hello, I'm Shoko. Thank you for inviting us today. I am Bon's wife. In 2008, kind of a turning point came, and I became more involved with Lafcadio Hearn. And now, I'm the coordinator of the Lafcadio Hearn Memorial Museum.
That's so awesome. We're so honored to have both of you today on the show. Now, Doug, you've actually had a chance to visit the Lafcadio Hearn Memorial Museum, right?
Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah, I went back in 2019, back in October of 2019 to Matsue through the Sister City Exchange Program, and was able to visit the Memorial Museum and his old residence as well. It was fantastic, beautiful, very beautiful. But before we go on a little bit more about Lafcadio Hearn and his life, I wanted to ask you a question about New Orleans, and maybe just ask this is something we ask all of our guests, just about their connection with New Orleans, if they have one. Have you ever been before? And if you have, what is your fondest or funniest or most unique memory from your time in New Orleans?
as you know, our city Matsue and New Orleans have become sister cities in relation to Lafcadio Hearn, and this year marks the 27th year. We have visited New Orleans several times. Each time, we are fascinated by the beautiful nature of tropical Louisiana, the historic cityscape of the French Quarter, Creole and Cajun cuisine, the sound of jazz, and the hospitality of the people. I never forget the scenery of the Gulf of Mexico for the first time at the Grand Isle that Hearn once visited, and the memory of the fireworks that I saw on the banks of the Mississippi on the 4th of July. Also, the memories of participating in the ghost tour are very impressive. We visited the tomb of Marie Laveau, a voodoo queen and friend of Lafcadio, in St. Louis Cemetery, the first, with a wonderful guide. For us, ghost tours are very unique that we sympathize with their idea of evaluating invisible ghosts as a resource.
In 2019, we were invited to the Nichols State University in Thibodaux for a special Creole dinner from Chef John Force and his students. It was a reproduction of the recipe for a cuisine Creole published by Lafcadio Hearn in 1885. We can't forget the food that looks and tastes beautiful, and we were surprised and delighted that Chef Jean Force still uses Hans La Cuisine Creole as a textbook. Bon asked why, and he replied, because it's a cookbook written by a writer, so we can learn the whole Creole culture at that time. We were impressed that Hearn's writings were passed down to modern New Orleans over 130 years. We are deeply grateful to Ms. Donna Fresh, Honorary Consul of Japan, for arranging this precious opportunity.
Wow, that's amazing. And particularly amazing since John Fosse actually made food for you. That's a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. So now I want to transition and give both of you a chance to tell us more about the life of Lafcadio Hearn in your own words.
My great-grandfather, Patrick Lafcadio Hearn, is a Greek-Irish writer, born in Lafcadio, Greece in 1850, raised in Ireland, educated in France and the UK, and immigrated to the United States alone at the age of 19. In the United States, he lived in Cincinnati, Ohio, and New Orleans as a journalist for about 20 years. Then he stayed in Martinique, French West Indies, for 2 years before arriving in Japan at the age of 39. His interest in Japan came from learning about Japanese culture at the World Expo in New Orleans from 1884 to 85. Hearn was fascinated by traditional Japanese culture in Matsue, where he was first assigned to Japan as an English teacher. And he married Setsu Koizumi, the daughter of a samurai, who met there. For the last several years, he taught at the Imperial University in Tokyo, but died of a heart attack at the age of 54. His 54-year life was a journey around more than half the globe. That life was a series of catastrophes. His beloved mother, Rosa, returned to Greece when he was 4, and his parents divorced at the age of 7. And at the age of 16, he lost his left eye. Before and after his arrival in the United States, he experienced destitute life, an illegal marriage with a former slave woman, Mattie, and 2 infectious diseases. However, from the experience of such catastrophe, I think he has acquired an attitude of understanding different cultures with an open mind. He grew up listening to fairy tales and ghost stories from his nanny, Catherine Costello, during his childhood in Ireland. That made him interested in the supernatural world throughout his life and realized that there was a kind of truth.
Great. Well, I think now we can probably move from talking about Lafcadio's life to his literary output, to his work. And I think probably the best place to start with this is talking about favorite pieces by Lafcadio Hearn. I know that my favorite is Cheetah, A Memory of Last Island, one that's very close to my heart, probably my own bias as a Louisiana boy. But I was curious, what's your favorite piece and why? Why is that your favorite?
My favorite one is Glimpses of Unfamiliar Japan. This was Hearn's first book in Japan, published by Autumn Mifflin Company in 1894, and became a 26-print bestseller in its first edition. This book is not a fiction, but a travelogue that depicts life in the San-in region, including Matsue. Because I like traveling, I may have a feeling of familiarity with this. This travelogue is very attractive because it captures not only what is visible, but also sound, incense, and the spirituality of people with all 5 senses, and describes it in the present form. If you read this book, you can get a lively image of the city of Matsue 130 years ago. And even now, many foreigners visit Matsue with this book.
Great one. And what about you, Shoko-san?
Kwaidan. This is his finest work among his retold folklore. He wrote the traditional grotesque Japanese tales narrated by his wife Setsu in English and infused them with literary spirits. In Kwaidan, Han wrote of a truth, which suggests that apart from simply existing as humans, there is a spiritual foundation in the world. He wrote Kwaidan to investigate his universal truth, and it has been translated into many languages around the world. Han's ghost story is more than just a horror. It contains human morals, the fun and the thrill of exploring another world, and love. I think it may be Han who translated the word that ghosts and goblins speak to us from other world.
Yeah, that's interesting. I've actually never my familiarity with Hearn's work is very limited, especially prior to going to Matsue. So going to Matsue made me want to know more about it. And I think Kwaidan, when I have the chance to sit down and read sometime, I would really love to read Kwaidan and check it out.
Yeah, it's definitely worth a read, and it's actually my favorite. I came across it through the Kwaidan Book Club from the Japan Society of New Orleans, and it was the first work that I ever read, and I just absolutely loved it.
Which story is your favorite in Kwaidan?
Oh, there are many. There are
many.
Let's see. There are many. One that always sticks out to me is Diplomacy.
Diplomacy. Okay.
Yeah, diplomacy is one that always sticks with me. And it's really interesting. I would say that's probably my favorite. And I also really enjoy the film. Has anyone seen the film?
I didn't know there was a movie.
Oh, really? I recommend that. Yeah. It's a 1964. 64. Yeah. 64. Yeah.
Directed by Masaki Kobayashi.
Four stories in it. Yeah. Omnibus. 4 stories. Yes.
A master filmmaker, Kobayashi. So in your last answer, you mentioned Koizumi Setsuko.
Yeah.
And she was Hearn's wife and Bon's great-grandmother.
Yeah.
But with such a famous spouse, unfortunately, she is often overlooked. So can you share more with us about her life and career and her importance to Hearn's work?
Okay. Setsu Koizumi was born in Matsue in 1868 as the daughter of a samurai. Shortly after birth, she was adopted by her relatives, the Inagaki family. The adoptive parents raised her by telling many folk tales from Matsue. As a result, Setsu became a literary girl who loves reading. However, after the Meiji Restoration, the samurai family was in financial distress, so Setsu could only receive school education until 4th grade of elementary school. And when she was 23, she was introduced by an acquaintance to take care of Lafcadio Hearn and was to become his life partner. She told Hearn many ghost stories, and he was fascinated by it and decided to marry Setsu. When Hearn was in Kobe in 1869, he officially married Setsu. Lafcadio Hearn was naturalized in Japan and called himself Koizumi Yakumo. It was the 191st international marriage in Japan. After moving to Tokyo, Setsu collected many old ghost story books and read them in advance and told her husband. Setsu made a great contribution to Hearn's literature. Most of Hearn's works in his later years were provided by Setsu. Hearn was grateful for that and always praised Setsu as the best wife in the world.
That's amazing. That shows a lot of things that I didn't actually know about her. I believe you said the 100, was it 191st?
91st.
That's just incredible. It's amazing that you're able to find the records of that too.
Back during that time period when an international marriage occurred, did the international person, the foreigner, change their name to Japanese typically, or was that a choice by Lafcadio Hearn?
Choice by Lafcadio Hearn, but I think it's a rare case.
Yeah.
Okay.
Because he was a British at that time. And so he wanted to protect his family and his property. If he become a Japanese, he can protect. But if he not, his property to goes to British family.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, that's why he decided to become a Japanese.
That makes
by
sense.
himself.
Okay, wow. So that was really, really interesting. There's a lot to unpack there. I just want to touch on the fact that the Koizumis actually got to eat recipes from the cookbook that Lafcadio Hearn actually wrote. So there it is. It's still in use today. It's just amazing. And that's such an amazing story. But I also want to touch on Shoko-san's recommendation of Kwaidan. Kwaidan was actually the first book that I read from Hearn and was absolutely, from that moment, captivated with his writing and his recapturing of the folklore in Japan at that time. Have you had a chance to read Kwaidan?
Oh yes, Yeah, I love the opening story. I love the story of Miminashi Hoichi. The one where the sort of priest acolyte, like, to protect the man, the sort of lute player from sort of malevolent spirits, writes like protective words all over the person's body, but forgets to write them on the ears. And so when the sort of malevolent spirit comes, rips the ears off of the person. But I think, I mean, I'm drawn to that one in so many ways, in part because it's kind of underlying theme is protection via writing. That writing, that writing those characters and those sort of prayers on the body is what protects one. And I think Hearn, I can easily see why he would be drawn to such a story about writing tied to protection, writing as a way of kind of protecting oneself against vulnerability, perhaps, or
Totally. Yeah, I was going to say the same thing. It makes sense why that story would have resonated with him, amongst all the folklore he was actually hearing. And what's also interesting is that story is actually the cover art on the film adaptation of Kwaidan. Uh, yeah, so the film is a 1964 Japanese film from the director Masaki Kobayashi, who's a master filmmaker, by the way. But he adapted several stories from the Hearn's Kwaidan collection, and one of the most cinematic and brilliant recapturings is of Hoichi, that story, and it actually is the movie poster, which is really cool because the movie poster, you see the writing all over his face but not on his ears, and it's just really cool to see it actually as a recreation of art. So totally worth checking out.
A year or so ago, before the pandemic, they did a screening of it at the Tulane Library.
Oh,
And I didn't
cool.
get a chance to go that night. I really wanted to go that night, and unfortunately I didn't get a chance to go.
So the last thing I want to touch on before we transition back over is Koizumi Setsu, Lafcadio Hearn's wife. I thought it was just incredibly fascinating
Hmm.
what they had to say about her life and legacy.
I mean, she's in so many ways his entry point. That through her he becomes connected to this old former samurai family that she belongs to, and she's his anchor. I mean, she anchors him not only in the culture of the space, right, but for a man whose family life had been so chaotic throughout his life, and whose romantic relationships had been um, sort of disaster after disaster. Um, that for I mean, in some ways, you read his biography and think how almost miraculous that his domestic life seems to flourish with her, and their relationship is something I'm still curious about. Among the sort of things I've read about it so far, I can't ever really quite get underneath the surface of what was going on there in their relationship to make it work as well as it did. When he passed away, Koizumi Setsu wrote a beautiful sort of short, sort of eulogy, obituary for her late husband. Recently, as recently as a few years ago, the Vietnamese American writer Monique Trong wrote a novel called The Sweetest Fruits. Um, and it's a fictionalized account, not of Lafcadio Hearn's life, um, but of the women in Lafcadio Hearn's life. It's divided into three parts, roughly. One of them about Rosa, his mother, are told from the perspective of Rosa, his mother. The second told from the perspective of Maddie Foley in Cincinnati, and then the final one told from the perspective of Koizumi Setsu in Matsue, and then later Tokyo. But so much of our era right now is in thinking through recuperating those voices and trying to reimagine those voices that were not part of the sort of official narrative at the late 19th century. And I think Monique Trong does a really excellent job imagining what might have been going through Koizumi Setsu's mind and her heart as she grappled with with a husband who was most likely at turns very sensitive and very gentle, and in other ways very moody and unpredictable and a bit prickly.
Yeah, wow. Definitely have to check out that book. So one last thing before we transition back over to our interview. We've noticed that sometimes you see Koizumi Setsuko written as just Koizumi Setsu, and other times it's Koizumi Setsuko. Neither of us actually know which one is the correct way, but if you're listening to this and you know, please let us know via email or even on our social media in the comments. So let's actually transition back over to our interview with the Koizumis and hear more from them.
While we're on the topic of sort of international relations and sort of crossing oceans with Hearn, one thing I want to ask about is that Lafcadio Hearn is, from what I can tell, relatively well known in Japan. Even when I've had Japanese friends over to my apartment and they see his books on my bookshelf, they're excited that that I know who he is. But here in America, many readers are not familiar with Lafcadio Hearn's work. So I guess for those readers, what piece of Lafcadio Hearn's writing would you recommend? What should a curious American reader begin with if they're reading him for the first time?
I would recommend Kaidan as the first book to be read by readers unfamiliar with the Hearn. Kaidan is a Japanese word that means ghost stories. This book consists of 15 retold Japanese ghost stories and 2 supernatural essays. Among them, Miminashi Hoichi, the ERS Hoichi, and Yukionna means snow woman, are very famous. Recently, Penguin Classics published Japanese ghost stories edited by Paul Murray. If you are not good at ghost stories, you may want to enjoy a virtual trip to Matsue in the Meiji era at Glimpses Unfamiliar Japan. Especially for New Orleans people, the books The New Orleans of Lafcadio Hearn, published by Louisiana State University Press, and Inventing New Orleans, published by University Press of Mississippi, are also recommended.
So, the next question really is, what do you think of Hearn's works about New Orleans and the works that he has about Japan? Because we just talked about, there's some books that he wrote about Japanese culture, but also New Orleans culture. What do those two types of work, what do they have in common? What are some of the shared themes in those books?
So he has collected ghost stories and explored invisible culture in both New Orleans and Japan, which is what he has in common. I think that is because he was already aware of himself as a folklorist in an era when the folklore had not yet been established. For example, he was close to Mary Lavo, a voodoo queen in New Orleans, and Takanori Senge, a chief priest of Izumo Taisha Grand Shrine, who was called the living god in Japan. He tried his best to understand the unique face of the region and country. The theme that Hearn was interested in was not the culture of the ruling class, but the culture of the common people. He also collected music played in the streets in New Orleans, in Japan as well. He collected children's play songs, bon odori songs, and workers' bark songs. He also uses his ear or sense of hearing to explore culture in both cities.
Throughout this interview, we've circled back to Glimpses of Unfamiliar Japan a few times, and this next question touches a little bit on that as well as other pieces like Kwaidan. In many of Hearn's works, he seems drawn to the spirituality of Japan. He's fascinated by the rituals of temple life. We see that in Glimpses of Unfamiliar Japan in the first section, My First Day in the Orient. And in other pieces like Kwaidan, he writes about the supernatural realm of ghosts and spirits. And of course, as we talked about, that's a connection between the world of Japan, the world of New Orleans. But I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more to Hearn's fascination with the spiritual and the supernatural in Japan.
Okay. Consider Hearn's own childhood experience. I don't think Hearn's interest in the invisible is unrelated to his childhood experience. I think it's because when he was a child, he had a nightmare of being attacked by ghosts, had a visionary experience, and his nanny, Catherine Costello, told him the ghost stories. As he grew up, he became even more fascinated by non-Christian culture at a seminary in northern England, questioning the behavior of hypercritical monks in Japan. During the Meiji era, when Hearn visited Japan, people were more religious and believed that God dwelled in large trees, rocks, and stones. I think he sympathized. Since coming to Japan, Hearn has retold about 100 ghost stories, and in his later years, he published a yokai encyclopedia called Goblin Poetry, with an interest in Japanese yokai or goblin culture.
Wow. Okay, so that was really interesting. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, it's a through line throughout his life. While he was, throughout his time in Europe and America, a mostly agnostic man, someone certainly skeptical of Western Christianity. He remained open, even in that sort of agnosticism, to a spiritual reality lurking behind the material world. I think he was such a sensitive person that he recognized at one level that the sheer sort of like on the surface level of the world was not the whole story, either sort of metaphysically or aesthetically, that there was some reality deeper than that going on in the world. And it drew him in New Orleans to a variety of, and even in the Caribbean and Martinique, to a variety of religious expressions through voodoo, through syncretic religions. And when he goes to Japan, he's also drawn to to Buddhist spirituality in particular. In fact, glimpses of Unfamiliar Japan begins with my first day in the Orient. He goes to temple after temple after temple. He can't get enough. Even in that first encounter with the nation, he is drawn almost immediately to the spiritual life of Japan, and I think in some ways he's able to access that spirituality, that Buddhist spirituality in Japan, precisely because he is entering into a space where he does not have any kind of like cultural baggage. He doesn't have to claw through the sort of nightmare experience at French Catholic school, to like the way that he would have as an adult, to like have to recover some kind of workable Christianity for him. He doesn't have to do that when he gets to Japan. He can come to this and be receptive to it on its own terms without a ton of baggage and conflict blocking him from an encounter with it. And so I think it's a through line of his life, is that for someone who was in some ways in his early life as hedonistic as he was, and as sort of skeptical as he was of like the institutional churches, he was a deeply spiritual man. He was not a kind of strict materialist in the philosophical sense. The ghost stories and stuff, I mean, I'm not saying that he believes in the particular ghost stories, but the reason he's drawn to that particular kind of folklore is because he does sort of have a fascination with the idea, well, is death the end of, all things, or is there something more to existence than just what we can kind of perceive with our five senses? And I know Koizumi Shoko in the interview talked a great deal about that, his appreciation for the depths of reality and the sort of metaphysical depths of reality.
Wow. So let's transition back over to hear the end of our interview with the Koizumis.
Now, this next question is sort of shifting gears a little, but it's sort of zooming out to the present day. You've both traveled the world introducing people to Lafcadio Hearn and his work. apart from the fact that he's your ancestor, and what a wonderful ancestor to have, why else do you think it's important for contemporary audiences to read and appreciate Hearn's work? What does Lafcadio Hearn have to say to us today as readers in 2021?
We are working to make many modern people aware of his open mind, which is the underlying idea of many of Hearn's works. Hearn hated Eurocentrism, Christian centrism, and anthropocentrism, and did not think that the world was complete in the human world alone. In addition, he believed that people should not forget their other invisible another world and nature. In 1894, he gave a lecture on the future of Japan in Kumamoto. In that lecture, he said that living in harmony with nature and living in a simple life is the most important for Japan in the future. Hearn has also published articles and works on at least 6 infectious diseases in his lifetime. In it, he evaluated human courage and kindness in such emergencies rather than attacking infected people. I think his fair and affectionate view of others resonate with the SDGs adopted by the United Nations.
Oh yeah, it's very interesting. The Sustainable Development Goals from the United Nations.
The Open Mind of Lafcadio Hearn project that we did, which began in 2009, was held in Athens, Matsue, New York, New Orleans, Lafcadio, Dublin, Cincinnati, and the other places around the world. The term Hearn's open mind was originally conceived by Takis F. Stasiou and is now sympathetic all over the world. Last year, South African researcher Anthony Godehas received his PhD in Lafcadio Hearn studies for the first time on the African continent. The webinar, which was held to commemorate the publication, had participants from 22 countries. There, Hearn's open mind was perceived as the opposite of division, in that it connects the East and the West, the people, and the living and the dead. I think Hearn's work has important hints for realizing the sustainable symbiotic society.
Mm-hmm. No, I appreciate a lot the sense that Hearn, you talked about rejecting anthropocentrism, saying that the human was not the center of the world, and that's one of the things I appreciate so much about his novella Cheetah, where the third portion of the novella is the hurricane, but not told from the human perspective. It's the hurricane told from the perspective of nature, which is something that's always drawn me to that book, that the natural world is the center of the narrative. So I very much was drawn to that part of your answer.
That's great. I mean, he's really had an impact on people, not just in Japan, not just anywhere else, but really around the world, a global figure, which is awesome.
Yes.
So we're kind of closing up on coming back towards the end of the interview. So I do want to take us back to Matsue. As I mentioned, I had traveled to Matsue back in 2019, and I visited his memorial museum, which is, again, beautiful, right next door to his home as well, his old residence. Can you tell us a little bit more about what the museum and his residence have to offer, but also if you have any other recommendations for travelers that may visit Matsue, maybe one other sightseeing location that you would recommend?
The Lafcadio Hearn Memorial Museum in Matsue opened in 1934 by donations collected by Hearn's students. It was only 30 years after he died. After 82 years, a renovated and expanded the museum opened in the summer of 2016, the 120th anniversary of his birth. We aim to create a simple guide in Japanese and English, which introduces Hearn's life journey, achievements, ideas, and main works. In addition to providing basic information about the author, the museum also shares information with places around the world which are related to Hearn. We also aim to collaboration with the institution of learning to create a place for educational activity for young people. And we have annual special exhibition. Fortunately, it is very well received by visitors from overseas. Please come and visit Matsue. And so Matsue Castle and motorboat and many temples and shrines still remains Lafcadio who loved the places.
Yeah, his museum is right next to the castle, correct?
Very near the same area of the preserved area. And so next to the museum, there is a still standing Lafcadio Hearn's old residence.
Yeah.
It's beautiful gardens and very old house. So beautiful, calm.
Yeah, that whole area is really fantastic. It's definitely one of my favorite areas in the city to just walk around. There's just so much in that one area that it has to offer.
Mm-hmm. And one more, the sunset of Lake Shinji on the Lake Shinji is so beautiful.
Yeah. I was able to catch that one day, so I totally agree.
Wow, that's amazing. Sad to say, I have never been to Matsue
yet.
After COVID-19, it is the first trip that I want to take. But what about you? Mm-hmm. Once the world returns to normal, what is the first place on both of your list to visit?
I would like to go to the Brittany Peninsula in France to experience Celtic culture and enjoy cider and garret. Of course, I would like to revisit New Orleans. This time, I would like to ride a float as a member of the Lafcadio Hearn crew in time for Mardi Gras.
Yes.
Let's do it.
So
Same here.
I have to go to America first because the reason is to return the precious lyrics borrowed from the descendant of General Bonaparte who live in Washington, D.C. at the 2009 exhibition. But the COVID-19, I couldn't return it. But when that mission is over, of course, I'd like to go to New Orleans afterwards. And I also want to go to Martinique, where I've never been.
I've never been either.
I've been to Martinique twice.
Wow.
Yeah, that's wonderful.
Lucky.
Wow, that's amazing. So we all have places to go on the other side of COVID. So can't wait.
Hopefully soon.
Yes, hopefully soon. So that concludes all of our questions that we had for you.
Thank you so much.
We had a great experience. Very important.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
No, thank you. You took the time out of your day to be here, so we really appreciate it. And I think a lot of people will learn about Lafcadio Hearn that maybe didn't know about him. So there may be some new readers that come out of this interview as well.
Yeah, we hope so. And so we can come to New Orleans anytime if you need us.
Please do.
Yes.
Please do.
Thank you so much for tuning in to this week's episode. We really hope you enjoyed our interview with the Koizumis and that this motivates you to check out Lafcadio Hearn's work. Matt, do you have any recommendations?
Once again, I've got to reiterate that my go-to biography, the one that I would say that, anyone, even a newcomer can come to it and find wonderful stuff there, and someone who has been reading about Hearn for years can come to it and find new and interesting stuff there, is Jonathan Cott's biography of Hearn, Wandering Ghost, The Odyssey of Lafcadio Hearn. I think that's a wonderful starting point for his biography. I think in a world today where we're deeply concerned with questions of cultural identity, of racial identity, I think Hearn provides us a model that allows space for humility, that allows space for receptivity, and allows space for contact, for really generous contact and cultural exchange. And I think provides us a model to do that contact that's still helpful today. And he's a beautiful writer. Like on top of all of that, of course I can make the kind of sort of ethical pitch, but here ethics and aesthetics dovetail quite nicely.
Be sure to follow us on Instagram and Twitter at Crew of Japan Podcast. We'll see you next week.